And now one of the problems with Iran and Venezuela and everything is that they are producers of oil. This new geopolitical development of the finding of gas, will it help Israel with this problem, the problem of Iran and all its satellites?
As I said, it's indirectly. The developments in the U.S. of the fracking, the shale oil, the fact that the U.S. will be less dependent on the Middle East is very important. I think in this respect, by the way, in energy and Iran, you mentioned Iran, I think Saudi Arabia is a rival of Iran as much as Israel is. And when the U.S. is now, has been considering and eventually was successful in imposing sanctions on Iran, I think they implicitly have received assurances from Saudi Arabia that if Iran will produce less oil, Saudi Arabia will increase its production of oil. So there will be no shortage in the world. So I think it's very important that some Arab countries, such as Saudi Arabia, the largest producer of oil in the world, is supporting the sanctions on Iran indirectly by assurances. They are certainly a rival of Iran, perhaps not as much as Israel, but close to that. We're both very worrisome about Iran, and so I think that's we should keep this in mind, that we are on the same side as Saudi Arabia, for example, in this respect, and in some way also Egypt.
So it's kind of very optimistic about the possibilities of peace in the region.
No, I wouldn't jump that far. This has been a long process and not very successful up to now. The blame could be shared by Israel and by the Palestinians and others. Israel, the settlement policy, I'm expressing now my own personal opinion, has not been very conducive for the peace process. The Palestinians demanded a freeze on settlements. Israel declined. The previous government, I don't think it can go anywhere, even in this government. A demand for freeze as a precondition for negotiations on peace. But maybe they'll find a solution by partially freezing it only in remote areas where the only small Israeli settlements are there, but not close to the Israeli borders. Maybe some partial freeze on settlement buildings. But the Palestinians, there are two other factors which have to be kept in mind. The Palestinians are very divided, of course, between the West Bank, Abu Mazen, and Hamas in Gaza. And the question is, whom do you negotiate? If you negotiate with Abu Mazen, does he represent Gaza? At this point, it doesn't seem that they have an agreement. And so, in Israel, people are saying, why should we make peace with Abu Mazen when Hamas will continue its attacks on Israel? And the second factor is, of course, the uncertainty in the Arab world, so-called what the Arab Spring has become. There are all these Syria, deep problems, very worrisome for Israel too, what Syria will become, with some jihadist groups among the rebels in Syria. Syria has many ethnic groups there, Sunnis and Shias and Kurds and Druze and so forth. Will Syria remain one country, or will it be falling apart into different regions with different rulers in different regions? Egypt is in deep trouble, the Arab Spring. Egypt is in deep economic trouble. They have a fiscal problem. They don't have enough money. They depend totally on the U.S. support at this point. And I think Morsi, the president of Egypt, representing the Muslim Brotherhood, understands his dilemma. On the one hand, he's in the Muslim Brotherhood, not very friendly to Israel, and so forth. But on the other hand, he and the army, the Egyptian army, totally dependent on the U.S. and on the goodwill of the West in general. So I think that's what keeps him intact. very complicated situation. So I think most Israelis are saying now at this point, perhaps we should wait and see what happens in the Arab world. So many uncertainties. Netanyahu said at one point, just imagine we would have given back the Golan Heights to Assad. And now Assad is in such trouble, maybe Assad will go soon. Assad will certainly go, but the question is only when, not if he will go.
And at what cost?
And at what cost, and who will replace it? That's the major issue. But if we would have given the Golan and then in Syria splits up to a jihadist group and Islamists, they would be near our border in the Golan Heights. And so I think the best policy under those kind of uncertainties is a wait and see. I think that's what many of the people who are looking at the defensive issue, at the security issue of Israel are saying, let's wait and see. We shouldn't rush anywhere before we see what happens in the Arab world.
And going back to Mexico, what did you recommend, or what do you recommend with that reform, the energetic reform, and the coming into the scene of private companies? What do you recommend? What would you recommend to Mexico?
Well, look, I mean, the major question that Mexico will have to confront is whether you would like or you need a constitutional change. This is very difficult legally, so I understand from my Mexican friends in the government. The question is, can they go around it without the constitutional change? Okay, and perhaps they can. On various issues, without getting into details. For example, Pemex is giving the pension, the people who retire from Pemex, very early age, by the way, of retirement, very generous conditions, for not surprising for a monopoly like Pemex. But perhaps the government could provide more of an incentive for Pemex to finance the pensions of its workers itself, and not take from the INS, from the other workers in the government, and so forth. So you should give Pemex incentives to become more efficient. I don't think a constitutional change is easy in Mexico. So maybe you should find smart ways to go around that.
Maybe Jewish ways.
Hopefully so. Yes.
Like to
yes, going around.
Going around, like yes, when they have a problem with the law and they find all kinds of
ways to go around it.
Ways to go around.
Yes.
And you talk a lot about fiscal laws and fiscalization.
Taxation, yes.
What is the importance of that subject in Mexico?
Of course, for example, first of all, I'm not an expert again on Mexico, but I understand the oil, the revenue the federal government is receiving from the oil, from Pemex, is distributed to the states. And the states, there is a real problem of transparency, accountability of what happens in the various states. There too, I think, there must be a reform in that. And the rules of how to allocate the money, the oil revenue, to the various states. Make them more transparent, make them more efficient. That's also a major issue in Mexico, and which hasn't been tackled yet. Again, very difficult. I understand politically it's going to be very difficult, but I think Mexico better do it earlier than later.
And how do you see the world energy-wise in the future?
I think slowly you have the issues of global warming, you have the issue of the atmosphere. So the world is facing major environmental issues, yes? But I am optimistic about this in the future. Global warming is a major world problem. Without agreement between the various countries, and you see up to now the Kyoto Agreement has not been implemented. The US doesn't want to do anything until China and India say how much they will reduce their emission of CO2. And I'm optimistic though. I think that there will be other methods found for reducing the global warming, the greenhouse effect, so-called the greenhouse effect. There are various methods, sequestering, putting the gases back into the ground, which is not economical now, back into the ground, and so forth. It's feasible, there's no question about it, but it's not yet economical. But They work on the technology. So I'm optimistic on finding energy, solar energy, green energy, and gas. Coming back to our issue, is certainly a better source for energy than any of the other things we had, like coal, which is environmentally polluting and very problematic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well.